Book 6, Flight of the Wounded Falcon, Chapter 2. You're as bad as your father and grandfather. Mari put the last of the dishes in the cabinet and glanced out to the dark window to the barn. Everything was quiet now that young Pear was going to be fine. Again. Mari had sent 15-year-old Canthe off to bed, assuring her that she didn't mind doing her chore that night. Mari wanted time to think, and somehow washing the dishes always helped. She was wiping off the work table when she heard quiet shuffling come from the west wing of the house into the kitchen. Mugga, I didn't think anyone was still up. Mari smiled. Hungry still, young Pear? He bobbed his head guiltily. Mari pulled out a chair and pointed to it. Young Pear walked uneasily to the table and sat down. Sore? Mari asked. Where? You name it, young Pear groaned. I think, however, there's a little spot under my left ribs that feels remarkably well. I try to focus on that point. Mari chuckled, pulled out a piece of peach pie from the cabinet, and placed it in front of her grandson. Last piece of pie? Is this Pugga's? Young Pear asked before stabbing the fork into it. He doesn't need to grow any more, Mari said, sitting down across from him. Remember, if he gets mad, this is your fault, right? Always is. She watched him take a few bites, his body moving awkwardly as he tried to force his tender muscles to cooperate. So, how did it feel? She eventually asked. Which part? He took another bite. The flying part. Young Pear swallowed. Amazing, Mugga. I was weightless. Can you imagine? I was part of the air, part of the world that wasn't the world. I can't explain it. I know what went wrong, though. I need bigger wings to hold out the blankets. And I think blankets were wrong as well. What I really need is... You want to do this again? Mari interrupted him. She was careful to keep her voice calm and unemotional. As long as she sounded like she was trying to help him, he told her all of his plans. No one knew just how many ideas his grandmother had talked him out of. Young Pear most likely would have died years ago, especially when he was 12 and had the idea of turning a small wagon into a device that rolled down the hills with only nature's laws propelling it, and young Pear's unreasonable idea of a fifth wheel in his hands controlling the direction. He got as far as putting wagon wheels he modified onto a large crate before Mari found him in the barn and reminded him that he would have no way of stopping. When he came to her later that afternoon with a plan for stopping his wagon, she told him he might as well call it a break, because that was what all his bones would do when he abruptly ended his forward motion. While Perrin insisted that many of young Pear's ideas came from her telling him to push the limits of what was known, even Perrin didn't know how often Mari stopped him from literally pushing himself past the limits. Except for yesterday. That young Pear didn't tell her any of his plans about trying to fly worried Mari immensely. He was now acting without her consultation. Young Pear looked up from his pie. You don't think I should try again? No, Mari said slowly, impressed with her ability to not show her shock at his lack of reason. She wondered how many times one could be hit on the head until it started to affect their ability to think clearly. Perrin had been planked at least half a dozen times that Mari knew about in order to render him unconscious to receive stitches, and his reasoning skills were still intact. Young Pear had been carried home unconscious about as many times, but soon some kind of damage would surely manifest itself. Maybe it already was. No, Mari said again, noticing the disappointment on her grandson's face. Not until at least after the marking trip. Give yourself some time to mend and to consider different possibilities to your wing configuration. Young Pear nodded slowly, the way he usually did when he agreed with what Mari suggested. It was times like this that Mari reflected on the conversation she'd had with Joriana years ago, days before she married Perrin. Mother Shin explained to Mari how Perrin had received all of his scars. Mari had taken notes that day, but left them an edge when they left the world. She remembered only a few of the stories now. As she looked into her grandson's dark eyes, she wondered just how much he resembled his grandfather at that age. They might have been identical, except that young Per had 2 scars on his forehead instead of the one older Per had, and young Per had never been hit with a stick by a girl who wasn't his sister or cousin. "All right, Mugga, I'll not consider another attempt until after we come back." Something in his tone of voice suggested his mind was already racing ahead to the day of their return. Mari knew she had to be satisfied with that. "How did the rest of it feel?" Young Per narrowed his eyes. "You mean the falling part?" Mari smiled. "Actually, quite interesting. I kind of wish it lasted longer." "What?" He took another bite. "Just to feel it a little longer, the sense of weightlessness. Maybe if I wore some kind of padding next time and jumped from a greater height." Mari closed her eyes. The boy would never live to see 18. She felt a light kick under the table and opened her eyes to find young Per grinning at her. "Gotcha, Mugga." Mari exhaled. "Oh, you're as bad as your father and your grandfather." "Don't worry," he said, finishing off his pie. "I won't do anything until we get back. I'm not sure I could climb for a few days anyway." Mari stood, took his empty plate, and gave him a kiss on the forehead. "Go rest, young Per, and think of boring, dull things. Maybe your sisters can teach you to do something safe, like sewing." "Oh, never mind. That involves sharp needles." Young Per chuckled as he stood up. His chuckling changed into a groan of pain. "Need help getting back to your room?" she asked. "No, that's all right, Mugga. I think I'm a little past being tucked into bed, even though Mama already did that tonight. I'll make it." She caught his arm. "Promise me. Promise me you'll always make it." He gave her half a smile, understanding her real question. "Of course. You can't get rid of me too easily, Mugga. I bounce too well." "You do bounce, I must admit." She squeezed his arm, and he winced. "Oh, I'm sorry. Go to bed now." Young Per gave her a quick kiss on the cheek and shuffled down to his room. Mari sighed and went back to wiping the table and noticed how wrinkled her hands looked. It was because of the dishwater, she told herself. It was only rarely that she was vain enough to fret about how she was aging. Perrin still looked at her the same way, just as she felt her heart skip a beat whenever she saw him. But then again, nearly every woman in Salem felt the same way about him. She still couldn't understand how it was that as Perrin grew older, the deep wrinkles around his dark eyes and the whiteness of his hair only made him more imposing and remarkable. No matter the size of the room, every person glanced his way when he entered the door. Then he'd smile, and half the women of Salem would try not to swoon. Well, maybe that was an exaggeration, Mari chuckled to herself. But not by much. He received the most stares from refugees coming from the world. Those who still remembered him would do a double take when they realized the old colonel stood tall and impressive in front of them, more striking than High General Ralph Shin ever was. The women would stare at him just a little bit longer, Mari noticed, but Perrin never did. But whenever Mari entered a room, she was just another little old grandmother, which was fine by her. There had been incidents in the past when those coming from the world remembered what supposedly drove Colonel Shin to the forests. Seeing that his wife was still alive surprised them. But Mari received their hardened stares only until Shem Zenas arrived, and the anger was shifted to the poor, innocent man's direction. Those stares would turn into outright shock when they then realized what Salem proclaimed the former sergeant major now to be. For some reason, it was almost too much. Then Salem would win them over. Usually. She wiped clean young Pear's dish and put it in the cupboard. He was only half joking about wanting to fall further. She could see it in his eyes. She often wondered what was going on in his head, and how he had become the most daring, fearless, and thick-headed young man she'd ever met. She sometimes wondered if it was one of those middle child cases. They never had this problem at Edge. There were no middle children. Of course, in Salem, middle children constituted the majority of people. But there was an understanding that some in the very middle, like young Pear, felt a need to distinguish themselves from their siblings. Mari and Perrin didn't understand that. They had frequently marveled at the diversity of their posterity. It never ceased to surprise them that each of their 25 grandchildren, and now almost 12 great-grandchildren, were completely different from each other. These children shared the same grandparents, lived in the same area. Because the houses were so close together, the cousins grew up more like siblings, and were exposed to the same upbringing, education, and beliefs, yet still resulted in so many different personalities. For some reason, Perrin and she had thought that after the first few grandchildren, the subsequent offsprings would be variations on the brighter or shim themes. But each child was so unique. Some were as tall and broad as their pugga. Others were as slight and petite as their mugga. And the rest fell somewhere in between. There were grandchildren with every color of hair, from the straight blonde hair of 21-year-old Ralph Shin, whose little boy Grunnock also seemed destined to be fair-haired, to the black wavy hair of 25-year-old Salima Brighter Zenas, whose two little boys, Brighter and Fennec, were remarkable blends of Grandpa Shem and Great-Grandpa Perrin. Every shade of eye color was also displayed in the family roll call, from light gray to nearly black. But the differences between young Pear and Cephas surprised Mari the most. Their mothers were expecting with them at the same time, so there was a merry war between the two families as to which baby would be delivered first. While there was no official competition in Salem, the rivalry between Jatesy and Pato was never fully quelled. In fact, it seemed to escalate, in a good-natured way, after Pato and Lilla married near the end of 339. Mari knew there was going to be continued trouble, albeit friendly, between her children. When Mari went to retrieve Dec, Jatesy, Salima, and little Cambozola, who they mercifully called Cambo, early in the morning of the 89th day of harvest, 340, she was there to announce the unexpectedly early arrival of Pato and Lilla's firstborn during the night. When the Brighter family eagerly arrived at Pato and Lilla's bedroom, Jatesy stopped and stared. Pato lay in the bed next to his half-asleep wife, wearing a smug smile. In his right arm was nestled one tiny little girl, and in his left arm, the second tiny little girl, Lorixania and Joriana Shin. "Lilla!" Dec exclaimed in an awe-filled whisper. "I'm thoroughly impressed. In less than 1 year of marriage, and in one expecting, you caught up to us." Lilla managed a proud but weary smile before drifting off to sleep. It was the quietest Mari and Perrin had ever seen their daughter-in-law. Of course, she had been quite vocal for the several hours preceding. She missed seeing Jatesy glaring at her brother. "How did you do that?" Jatesy demanded. Pato grinned. "Not going to tell you now, am I?" He sniffed the heads of his babies. "I married a very practical woman, that's all. Why have one at a time when you can have two? At this rate, we'll have 6 children before you have 4. Jatesy would have put both of her hands on her hips, but one of them was holding her 6 moons old son. Her narrowed eyes were challenging enough. Perrin and Mari, standing together by Lilla's bed, stifled snorts of laughter as Jatesy gave Dec a very deliberate look. His eyes grew large. 11 moons later, Pear Brighter was born. He was called Pear only a handful of times because Cambo gave him a new name. Since he couldn't yet say pear or baby or brother properly, Pear became Bubba. Everyone agreed that Bubba Brighter had a certain rhythm that couldn't be improved upon. It was rather fortunate that the Bubba name stuck, because shortly after young Perrin was born, Lilla called him Young Pear to go along with Papa Pear, her nickname for her father-in-law. In fact, most everyone had forgotten that Bubba's given name was Pear, and his bride Alexin didn't know he had a different name until the day before their wedding. Not to be outdone, soon after Pear Bubba arrived, Uncle Pato announced at a family dinner that Lilla was expecting again. And in 342, Relfshin came to Salem. So naturally, in the next year, Halling Brighter arrived, followed by Barnoshin a year after that. Then Vidro Brighter came, and Heisemumshin arrived 2 seasons later. It was only a matter of time until both Jatesy and Lilla would be expecting at the same time. That's what happened in 346, and it was a race, unofficially of course, to see who would deliver their 6th baby first. Each morning, their fathers would speak to the bellies to urge them that they needed to emerge before their cousin. Every day, the siblings would pat their mothers and tell the new baby to come out and play before the cousin could. In the end, Cephas Brighter was born first that harvest season, followed by Perrin Shin the Younger only 3 days later. Mari and Perrin had thought that when their brood of 12 grandchildren had arrived, that was the end of babies. But Jatesy said they still hadn't brought Dec's mother's name, Susie, to Salem. And 8-year-old Selima, now with 5 younger brothers, begged her mother daily for a baby sister. That's when Pato pulled out the family lines and noticed that while Vidro, the great-great-great-grandfather, who had the dream about recording the family lines before the first King Quarrel could destroy them, made it to Salem, his wife Canthe hadn't yet. So, shortly after Susie Brighter was born, Canthe Shin, as well as her twin brother Newell Shin, made their appearances. Jatesy couldn't abide the fact that Lilla and Pato had outdone her by having twins again. So in the next year, Tabit Brighter came to Salem, but was soon followed by Q Shin. Pato also realized that while Tabit was there, so needed to be Hogel. So in 351, Hogel Shin arrived, followed only 2 moons later by Banu Brighter. Then Sakal Shin came to Salem, followed by Atli Brighter. Then Sentia Shin and Yanali Brighter in 355. That year, Mari made family line charts for her, Perrin, and Dec of the ancestors they knew. That way her grandchildren could see the names they represented and be the means of bringing some of their ancestors to Salem, at least in name. Author's note: if you have access to the printed book or my website, or I think I'll also be able to put it on YouTube, I do also have these charts that you can see that I made because I had to keep track of these kids' names too. End of author's note. In 356, the baby race finally ended. Perrin called it a tie. Although Pato and Lilla had 13 children, it was through only 11 expectings. Jatesy and Dec, on the other hand, had endured 12 expectings for 12 children. Perrin said the Brighter's last boy, young Shem, named in honor of the man who got the Shins and Brighters to Salem, should have counted as 2 babies, since when he finally arrived he was so large, Perrin declared he could have walked out himself had he been in the right position. The difficulty of that birth brought an end to Jatesy's childbearing, even though she was only 36. And Lilla, at 35, convinced Pato they really had won the baby race with their 13th child, Mora, named for Mari's grandmother, and born several weeks earlier, and they could stop now too. Mari was quite relieved. She had worried at times that her children were taking her dreams of being surrounded by children too much to heart. It wasn't until a few days after Cephas and young Per were born that she finally revealed to them the dreams she had experienced since the night she and Perrin were first engaged. She told them about the large house with weathered gray wood, and by 3:46, when the boys had arrived, the wood on the house had turned gray, and their house had grown even larger than Mari had remembered in her dreams. The window boxes, the gardens, the mountains encircling them, and the children running through it all. With the birth of young Perrin Shin, she and Perrin now had the 12 grandchildren she had envisioned, and even more. There were actually 2 large gray houses, a garden and an orchard, and she told her family that not only had her dreams been fulfilled, they had in many ways been doubled. Dec had grinned at that. "Well, maybe we should double the number of children you saw, too." Pato rubbed his hands together and gave Dec a challenging look. But Jatesy and Lilla, both resting on the sofas in the Shin's gathering room and cradling their newborn sons, regarded each other wearily. "Remember, boys," Perrin said sternly, "there's no competition in Salem. You need to let your wives recuperate and let them decide if they can handle more. They each now have 6 little ones. You need to think about your wives." Lilla had laid her head back on the sofa and sighed as she patted her 3rd tiny son. "Ah, Papa Pear, they do. That's how we end up this way." Shem and Calla weren't left out of the baby race, although the competition wasn't nearly as fierce in the Zenith Shin Brighter battle. In the rare years that there were no Shin or Brighter babies, there were Zenith's babies. In 341, they had their 2nd son, Boskos, and 2 years later came their 3rd son, Zadok. But in 345, when Vidro and Hysamum came, so did the Zenith's first daughter, Miki. With no Shins or Briders born in 347, Shem and Calla got a little more attention when their 2nd daughter, Esther, was born, and their last daughter, Huldah, came at just a few weeks before Tabit Brighter. The 3 families went without new babies for only 2 years, because shortly after young Shem and Mora arrived, bashful and quiet Lek Zenas and bossy and loud Salima Brighter surprised almost everyone with the decision to unite the Zenas and Brighter families officially. Since the time they were 15 and 14, Salima's and Lek's mothers had suspected something might be going on between them. And while Shem and Dec brushed away the suggestion of a potential romance between their oldest children, Calla and Jatesy watched them closely, looking for signs. When Lek, at age 17, came to Dec asking if he could work with the cattle with him, Jatesy had a feeling it was to be that much closer to the Brighter household. Dec said it was because Lek's grandfather, Bosco Zenas, was a rancher too, and on that land. A year later at a family party, 18-year-old Lek shyly announced that he had found a bride. And 19-year-old Salima shouted, "It's me!" Most of the family was sufficiently stunned that they had managed to keep their courtship a secret. But Calla and Jatesy had beamed smugly at each other. A year after their marriage, they made Perrin and Mari great-grandparents, and Shem and Calla, and Jatesy and Dec, first-time grandparents to Brighter Zenas, with more to follow. Perrin's dream to become a builder was also fulfilled during those years. He had just finished the addition to their house for Mari and him, shortly after Pato and Lilla's wedding, when the Brighter house needed another bedroom added. Although many men in the community came to help, Perrin enjoyed doing as much of the work as he could on his own. He made sure new rooms could be easily added onto each house, and even helped Shem with a few additions and renovations to his house. By the time the house building was ended, both homes had additions with bedroom after bedroom added next to each other, sharing fireplaces. Then it was time to start building Lek and Salima a house along the lane between the Zenas and Brighter houses. So the home building continued. Lori and Jory married brothers who wanted to live near their parents on the eastern side of Salem. But soon enough, Cambo announced his engagement, and the housing boom continued. One afternoon, not long ago, Maury looked at the houses and smiled to think that if they had all been pushed together, they would have been the size of the mansion in Idemia, with more guest houses than Joriana could have built. The weathered gray wood looked far warmer than the perfectly set stones of the mansion. And they had more extensive grounds here than the mansion had, with more useful plantings than ornamental flowers and budding trees which produced no fruit. She'd once considered leaving Idemia a sacrifice, but she could never have imagined what great blessings the Creator had in store for her. Maury looked around the darkening and now spotless kitchen, searching for something else to wipe. To her surprise, the door to the garden opened, and her oldest granddaughter peeked in. "Mugga, I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Well, I live here, Salima," Maury said, and nodded at Salima's enlarged belly. "Everything all right?" Salima patted her future third child. "Everything's fine. Papa Shem had noticed a light on here when he came back just now, and he wondered if everything was still all right with young Pear." The hesitant quality in her voice told Maury that wasn't the entire reason. Salemites were terrible liars. "Young Pear's gone to bed for the night, so no, he doesn't need any of your lectures." Salima chuckled and took a rag from the wash basin. "Oh, but I have some good ones too, Mugga." She began to wipe the sparkling cabinets, and Maury smiled. The need to clean when worried trait had been passed down to her granddaughters as well. And Salima had been delivering lectures to the younger children since she was 4. "I've got the 'Do you realize what this does to your family' lecture." He heard it, Maury assured, from Pato. "Ah, well, there's my 'Do you realize you have siblings, cousins, and nephews watching your behavior?'" Maury pondered as she wiped nothing off the counters with Salima. "Your Pugga may have given him that one after I left." Salima nodded thoughtfully, a lock of her black wavy hair falling into her face from her loose bun. She brushed it back with the impatience of a general. Maury frequently wondered what Salima could have become in the world if she were male. Most likely another Shin officer. But she had to be content with issuing orders to her family. Interestingly, the only person she deferred to, besides her grandfather, was her quiet and gentle husband. Lex Zenas had an unusual calming effect on her, which Deck wished he could have learned when his oldest daughter became an overly forthright teenager. "Well, I've got a few others." "That you should probably keep to yourself," Maury recommended. "Or write them down, put them in a box, and read them to Brighter or Fennec when they act up." Salima scoffed. "Ugh, my boys will never need those lectures," she declared, only partly in jest. "Instead, I'll pull them out for Lori and Jory's boys. Those two are far more troublesome than mine." Maury laughed and patted Salima's belly. "What about this one? It might be a very difficult boy." "Oh, the Creator and I have been discussing this one," Salima said with mock piety. "I've told him that it's time that I get a sweet, calm little girl." "So someone who takes after her father?" Maury teased. "Yes," Salima agreed. "The Creator knows how I've suffered with 5 younger brothers before I got a sister, so he best not let something like that happen again." She nodded up to the ceiling, as if giving a notice to the Creator. Maury rolled her eyes. "Oh, just for that, he's going to send you a boy. You realize that, right?" Salima winced. "Oh, please don't say that, Mugga. Mama Calla already told me that. And," she looked around guiltily, "she's actually the reason why I'm here. She was wondering about Lilla. How's she doing?" "Upstairs and probably asleep already," Maury said. "She didn't sleep well at all last night. So after she tucked in young Pear," "which I'm sure he was thrilled about," Salima chuckled. "Oh, yes," Maury sighed. He protested enough. After that, I sent her to bed. She looked absolutely exhausted. Well, good. That she's resting, I mean, Salima clarified. Calla was so worried, but she didn't want to look like she was checking up on her baby sister. You can go back and tell her that everyone's well, and that young pair will even be able to hold your belly for you when it's time to convince number 3 in there that it's time to come out. Mari snorted at what she knew would come next. Salima threw down her rag in aggravation. Look, young pair does not have any gift of nature like Mama Calla. Just because he holds his sisters' bellies and they went into labor the next day to have their boys doesn't mean he has Calla's so-called power to encourage birthing. It worked with Ralph's wife, too, Mari egged on her granddaughter. Madeline gave birth to Grunnock the next day. We've studied this in my midwifery classes, Salima glared, looking a great deal like Perrin. It's just a coincidence, but if it isn't, it's because my cousin brings with him so much aggravation that when he touches women's bellies, they feel great worry that something awful will happen, which then triggers their deliveries. Extreme stress can do that, you know. And I'm not having another boy anyway, so I don't need him anywhere near me. Mari laughed at Salima's agitation. You still have what? 12 weeks left? You'll be spewing fire by then. Salima tried to hide her smile, but it leaked out anyway. Oh, Mugga, I'm sorry, but you know what I mean. Besides, I plan to have this baby by the book. No young pair or any other odd family customs. By the book, Mari said dubiously. There's no such thing. Oh, there is, Salima assured her. I helped deliver a baby just this morning that was very predictable. And my last 2 were also quite routine, so I should be able to handle this one all by myself. Mari's eyes grew big. With a little help, her granddaughter added. Mari sighed in relief. Ah, such as your mother, mother-in-law, husband, midwife. Salima's face didn't move. Oh, no, Salima. Mugga, all I need is Lek. We can do this alone. I really do know what to do. It's different from the other end, Salima. I don't like bothering Mama and Calla. They want to be bothered by this. My husband is quite capable. Salima, Lek passes out when they steer the bulls. Salima held up an authoritative finger. But he's excellent at calving. Papa even says so, and that's high praise. And what does Lek think of your plan? Mari pressed. Salima pursed her lips. He doesn't exactly know it yet, Mugga, and I trust you'll keep this between the 2 of us. She arched her one eyebrow as if there were simply no other alternative. But Mari had dealt with stubborn officers. Salima, Mugga. Mari's lips twisted. Salem was a city of honesty, and she knew how to circumvent that when the need arose. You can trust me, Salima. Trust her to confide in her mother Jatesy, her mother-in-law Calla, and most especially her husband when the time was right. But because Salima had been raised in Salem, she didn't understand how someone could sound like they were telling the truth when they were actually lying. She smiled at her grandmother, satisfied that she had won the battle. Thank you, she said with a nod. You'll be impressed. Mari put an arm around her granddaughter, who stood a head taller than her. Is that what this is about? Salima, I'm thoroughly impressed by you every day. You have nothing to prove. Just be safe and make sure this new one is safe too. She patted Salima's bulge with her free hand. Please. Salima put an arm around her grandmother. We'll be safe, don't worry. I'm not the one who's causing problems, you know, she added in a whisper. But Mari scoffed internally. Each of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren gave her plenty to worry about, in different ways. Go back to Shem and Callus, Mari told her. Assure your mother-in-law that her sister is just fine. Then you get home and let Lek in on your brilliant little idea there. Let him decide if he can handle you all by himself. Salima chuckled and squeezed Mari. He handles me just fine. And none of us knows how he does it. Salima laughed, kissed her grandmother's cheek, and let herself out the door. Mari sighed and put the cleaning rags away, knowing it was time to try to go to bed. It was nights like this that she found it hard to sleep. As concerned as she was about Salima's overconfidence, and she was sure Lek would balk at her idea, her thoughts traveled back to young Per, another overly confident grandchild. Maybe that was a Shin family trait, she considered with a touch of despair. As Mari approached the door that led to their wing of the house, a small gathering room, a private washroom, large bedroom, and Perrin's office, she saw light coming through the bottom of the door. Perrin was still up. Silently she opened the door to see him sitting in his big chair in the gathering room, reading. The candlelight reflected off his white hair and cast soft shadows on his features. Mari stood in the doorway watching him and sighed in pleasure. "Why are you still awake?" she eventually asked. He looked up from his reading, his dark eyes brightening when he saw her. "Waiting for you. Talk to him?" Mari came into the room. "Yes, you were right. He came out again for a late snack." "Gave him my pie, didn't you?" "I knew you wouldn't mind." Shin men respond well to evening pie. What did he say? "That he wouldn't try anything before the marking party, but I think he's still planning something. He's not telling me as much anymore. I'm not sure why." "Maybe he thinks he's outgrowing you." "Thanks, Perrin, just what I needed to hear." She sighed sadly. "You know what I mean." "Yes, I do. He thinks he doesn't need his mugga anymore." "But he does," Perrin assured her. "But what he needs and what he thinks he needs are two different things." She sat down on the big chair opposite of him and put her feet up on his lap. Automatically, he started rubbing her ankles. "What did you men talk about when we were in the gathering room?" Perrin shrugged. "Nothing new. Peto's discouraged again. He still thinks he's responsible for young Per's actions." "That's not what he said to the Tans when they talked to him about their son leaving for a dissenter colony. Mrs. Tan told me Peto gave them great comfort, reminding them that their son's actions are his own, and that no matter where he went or what he did, the Creator was watching him. Why can't Peto believe his own words?" "I'm not sure," Perrin said. "Perhaps he thinks he's being held to a different standard. But he's going out with Shem tomorrow morning to the entrance. I was planning to tell the guide what's bothering his rector. Maybe Shem can give him some perspective." "He usually can," Mari nodded. "And I'd almost forgotten about tomorrow with all the excitement of the past 2 days. I'm glad you reminded me. Now I have something else to worry about." She exhaled with dread. Perrin chuckled as he massaged. "He'll go fine as usual. I'm actually looking forward to this one. Should be an interesting reunion." Mari rolled her eyes. "For you, they always are. For me, they're still days and weeks of analytical glares and careful watching to see if I'm really what everyone says I am. I'm a great-grandmother, for crying out loud. I don't run around with soldiers." He stopped rubbing, his eyes developing a familiar glint. "You run around with me." Mari shrugged. Perrin sighed. "I am sorry about that. After all these years—" "It's all right," she assured him. "It really is. I'm not bothered anymore in here," she pointed to her heart. "Just a little bugged in here," she pointed to her head. "But in time, they all remember you as you really were." Mari smiled, but she wasn't so sure. This was going to be more personal than any of the others. To comfort herself, she gazed again at the large painting that nearly covered the wall of their little gathering room. For their anniversary a few weeks ago, Perrin had asked a landscape artist to create for them a painting of the ancient temple ruin where they had trekked so often. The Shins had expected a small picture, but the artist, knowing how much they loved the site, created an immense painting of breathtaking realism of the entire area, with details and colors that left both Perrin and Mari speechless. But the best part was that she had included both of them in the painting, smiling and leaning on either side of a pillar at the top of the stairs of the crumbling temple. They were only a few inches high, but even then the detail was astonishing. They discovered later that the artist had been surreptitiously following them. Their grandchildren, in on the surprise, had found occasion to ask them to lean against things so that the artist could quickly sketch them at the correct heights. Mari and Perrin had thought something sneaky was going on. Their grandchildren giggled too much, and Salemites didn't do sneak too well. But still they were surprised by the final product. On nights like this, Mari stared at the painting and wished she and Perrin were at the ancient site again, as they had been dozens of times, all alone. 24 years ago, for their anniversary, they'd been all alone in Terep's vast land, and they enjoyed it so much they went back 3 more times. But the distance to the massive step pyramid temples was far, the travel long and often arduous. However, Mari and Perrin discovered that they could be up at that nearby ancient temple site in just a few hours, wandering the massive tableland and speculating about the carvings on the ruins, where Glees saw in vision would be the site of their last day, became their new favorite place. Years ago, Mari was Perrin and Peto's test mule, as they called her. She tested every route they found to the ancient site, riding on a rickety old mule. If she could make it, then so could just about everyone else. But then there were days when Perrin would whisper into her ear, "Feel like running away and taking Clark for a ride?" And she knew to slip off to the kitchen to pack some food while he grabbed some bedrolls, and like the teenagers in the world who'd skip out on her classes, they'd run away to the ancient temple site, often overnight. Of course, that was only when Mari wasn't needed to teach her courses at the university, and Perrin's duties were completed for the day, and they winked at Peto or Lilla so they'd know that Pugga and Mugga were taking off again. The last time they did it was just a few weeks ago, for their 44th anniversary, just before they'd been presented with the glorious painting. Since Clark was now far too old for such excursions, they'd taken Gray Clark 411, the latest Clark descendant chosen from the horse breeders for their barn. But while Perrin said the animal was sturdy enough, he just wasn't black enough. So he'd swapped it for a new Clark. Mari thought its name was 314, to test for a few weeks. She wasn't entirely sure how the horse breeders came up with their numbering system of Clark descendants, but she suspected the first digit had to do with the generations away from the original Clark. Salemites loved to keep track of family lines, even animal lines, and Clark's family was several hundred, if not thousands, strong. There were the regular black Clarks, the gray Clarks, and the mare Clarkesses, all of which were usually renamed to something more unique by the new owners. However, nearly every Clark that came to their barn kept the number, usually dropping the first digit. Mari sighed longingly as she gazed at the new painting. New Clark 314 needed testing, didn't he? Could they just run away tomorrow again and escape the world? But she knew to not even bring it up, because tomorrow the world was coming by again for a visit, and it was expected for midday meal. Peto stepped into his bedroom and stopped at the door to watch his wife. She was sitting on the edge of their bed, brushing out her long, light brown hair, which usually kept into a bun. She was still as sturdy as when Peto fell in love with her when they were 18, but she had softened over the years, mainly because each baby she bore left behind a layer of softness. While Jatesy was still just as lean and slender, despite her 12 expectings, Pato thought women should be curvier. He loved Lilla's shape, but learned years ago not to compliment her squishiness. What she added in weight, and how could she not, being the best cook Pato had known next to his grandmother Hysamum, she had lost in vibrancy, primarily because of a certain child who kept her wringing her hands for so many nights. Then again, Pato frequently reminded himself, he was also far more sober than when he was a teenager. Fatherhood, and being the rector of their large congregation, had a tendency to force a man to look at life through more serious eyes. "New'll get back all right?" Lilla asked absently. Pato shut the door behind him. He just finished putting Clark 314 away. Both Lori and Jory were very relieved to hear about young Pear. Lilla went back to brushing a little more vigorously. "And what's Newell's evaluation of the latest Clark?" "Well, not that a 15-year-old is any authority on horses, but he agrees with Deck and me that this is the best Clark descendant we've had. They got to the 2 Cadby homes in record time, and when I saw him in the barn just now, 14 looked as if he could easily handle another run to the eastern side of Salem and back." "Good, good," Lilla said distractedly. "He's nice, big and black enough. 14 is what we're calling him now?" Pato smiled sadly. She didn't care one bit about horses and didn't even realize they had a new Clark until he'd been in the barn for several weeks. Gray Clark 411, while a beautiful and impressive animal, just didn't have much horse sense, Perrin decided, and Clark, a very sensible and slightly ornery 30-year-old, regularly snubbed him. While the Zenuses had 2 excellent mares, Clarkus 328 and a gray Clarkus named Silver, and Barnos regularly used another descendant, Gray Clark 210, Perrin was highly selective of who replaced the first Clark, who had finally been put to pasture 10 years ago. Clark's approval was also needed as to who he'd share his pasture and his master with. Clark 14, a 5-year-old great-grandson of Clark, seemed to have been accepted by the herd. Pato had watched, amused, as Perrin and Clark seemed to evaluate the young stallion a few weeks ago as he trotted around the field. Perrin frequently pointed something to Clark and talked to him as if he expected an answer. Clark nodded and neighed and seemed to call out to the newcomer. Eventually Clark walked over to Clark 14, nuzzled him in greeting, and Perrin declared they'd found their new horse. Lilla had thought Gray Clark 411 had just gotten sooty. Pato walked over to her, gently took the brush out of her hand, and gathered her hair in his hands into one large ponytail. Lilla closed her eyes and leaned against her husband with a heavy sigh. "You all right?" he whispered to her. She nodded her head, then shook it. Pato hugged her head into his chest. "Tell me." "Oh, Pato, I've been all over the place today, weeping for fear, weeping for joy, fearful he wouldn't come back, almost afraid he would, so frustrated, so angry, so happy, so... How can he keep going like this? We can't. I can't keep up with him. A whole night and day he was out. He's never been unconscious that long before. And then he gets up and eats and joins family prayer and sneaks pie with Mari as if he's only had a late nap." Pato didn't interrupt her. Something else he'd learned over the years. There were times she'd lapse into incoherency as she let loose and babbled. But Pato could always figure out the string of her thoughts by the end. When she'd stop to breathe again, he'd be right on track with her. "Then he just easily apologizes, and Perrin had to help carry him home, and the children were all watching them. Why didn't any of them stop him? Is he now their greatest entertainment? And he didn't think any of this through. He just went running off. What kind of a test is that? Throw a rock off the roof first with the blankets and see how fast it hits the ground. But no, let's do something stupid to make everyone worry that this time he's not coming back." Pato stroked her head as she wept into his shirt. That was why he hadn't taken it off yet. It would be her handkerchief again. I know, he soothed. I know. I felt the same things. Oh, Pato, I just dread that... That what? He kissed the top of her head. That this will all end horribly for him, she whispered. Pato sighed. Again, I felt the same thing. Said so to Deck and my father. She sniffed. And what did they say? That we can't think that way. That we can't think young pair will come to some terrible end. Lilla sat up and wiped her nose. And my father thinks he would have made a great army officer. Lilla scoffed a laugh and wiped her eyes. Papa Pear has some of the strangest ideas sometimes. Deck and I both thought so as well. He stroked her cheek. We can't control young Pear, Lilla. That's not our calling. Our duty is to teach him, love him, raise him the best we can, then let him be free to make his own decisions. The refuser tries to control us, but the Creator never will. We have to be like the Creator. This life is young Pear's test, too. Thank you, Rector Shin, Lilla said formally. Been practicing that long? For the past half hour, Pato confessed. I almost believe it myself. He sat down on the bed next to her, and she put her arms around him, kissed his cheek, and leaned against his shoulder. That's the problem, Pato. This life is his test as well. A test I fear he may fail. Shh, don't talk like that, Pato told her. You're thinking the same thing I am, Pato. I know you are. We have to brace ourselves for the worst, I suppose. Pato rocked her as new tears fell from her eyes. And that's the end of Chapter 2. Thank you.